Hello, welcome to Blacktop Files. Tonight we bring you a set of accounts from men who wandered into places that were left behind long before they were born. Towns that died so completely that even the roads leading to them started to vanish from the maps. Blacktop Files is about long-form horror that feels uncomfortably real, stories collected from across the United States that sound like testimony because that's exactly what they are. Tonight we're focusing on the ghost towns of Appalachia, those clusters of rotting houses and empty streets, tucked into hollers and ridge lines where coal ran out, or the highway got rerouted, or the jobs just disappeared. Most people drive past the turnoffs without noticing. Some people take the turn anyway, either because they're lost or curious, or working a job that sends them into places no one's supposed to be anymore. What they found in those towns doesn't fit into any reasonable framework, and the patterns between these cases suggest that some places don't stay empty just because people left. If you want more horror that feels uncomfortably real, make sure to subscribe to Blacktop Files. Turn on notifications so you never miss a file, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight, whether that's a city, a small town, or somewhere in between. Let's start with a surveyor who thought the hardest part of his job was the terrain. I do land surveys for a firm that works with state agencies and private developers, mostly in Virginia and West Virginia. It's not glamorous work. You're out in the woods with equipment, taking measurements, mapping boundaries, checking old deeds against current topography. A lot of the time, you're alone or working with one other guy, and you get used to that. You get used to the quiet, the long drives on bad roads, the way some places feel like they haven't been touched in decades, because they haven't. 3 years ago, I got assigned to survey a tract of land in southern West Virginia that a developer wanted to buy for a hunting lodge or some kind of retreat. The land had been in dispute for a while, something about unclear property lines and old family claims that never got fully resolved. My job was to go out there, walk the boundaries, take GPS readings, document structures if there were any, and file a report. Standard stuff. The maps I was given showed a few old roads, a creek, some elevation changes, and a note that there used to be a coal town in the area, abandoned since the early 70s. I drove out on a Tuesday morning in late October. The weather was clear but cold, the kind of cold that gets into your joints and stays there. The main highway took me most of the way. Then I turned onto a state route that got narrower and rougher the farther I went. Eventually, I was on a gravel road that didn't show up on my GPS, just a thin line on the paper map I'd printed. The trees were close on both sides, oaks and maples mostly bare, and the ground was covered in leaves that hadn't been disturbed by tire tracks in a long time. I parked where the road got too rough for my truck and started hiking in with my gear. The developer's notes said the old town site was about 2 miles in, near a bend in the creek. I'd done this kind of work dozens of times, so I wasn't nervous, just focused on keeping my bearings and marking waypoints as I went. The forest was quiet in that heavy way it gets in fall, no birds, no wind, just the sound of my boots on the leaves and my own breathing. I reached the town site a little after noon. It wasn't much, maybe 15 or 20 structures still standing, most of them barely more than frames. There were a few houses with collapsed roofs, a building that might have been a store, and something that looked like it used to be a church, though the steeple was gone and the walls were leaning. Everything was gray and soft with rot, and the vegetation had grown up through the floors and around the foundations. There were old roads too, just dirt tracks now. but you could still see where they'd been graded. The whole place had that feeling of being forgotten on purpose, like no one had come back even to salvage anything. I started taking measurements and photos, working my way around the perimeter. The boundaries were tricky because a lot of the old markers were gone, buried under leaves or washed away. I had to rely on GPS and some old survey notes from the 40s that barely matched the current terrain. It was slow work, and I was trying to finish before it got dark because I didn't want to be out there with just a headlamp. Around 2 in the afternoon, I was near the eastern edge of the town, close to the creek, when I noticed something that didn't fit. There was a house, better preserved than the others, with most of its walls intact and a roof that was sagging but not collapsed. The windows were gone, just empty frames, and the door was hanging open. What caught my attention was that there were footprints in the mud near the porch, recent ones, maybe a day or 2 old, based on how sharp the edges were. I thought maybe it was another surveyor, or someone from the developer's office, or even a hiker, though this wasn't the kind of place people hiked to. I called out, just in case, but there was no answer. I walked up to the house and looked inside. The interior was gutted, floor mostly rotted through, but there were signs that someone had been there. A plastic water bottle, empty, sitting on a windowsill. A folding chair, the cheap kind you get at a gas station, set up in the corner. A sleeping bag, rolled up and tied, leaning against the wall. I didn't think much of it at first. People camp in weird places, and maybe someone had been using the house as a shelter. I took some photos for my report and moved on. But as I kept working, I started noticing more things that didn't fit. There was a fire pit outside one of the other buildings. Not recent, but not old. Either maybe a few weeks. There were paths through the undergrowth, faint but deliberate, connecting some of the buildings. And there were more footprints, different sizes, in the mud near the creek. I was starting to feel uneasy, not because I thought someone was going to jump out at me, but because it felt like I'd walked into the middle of something without realizing it. I decided to finish the eastern boundary and come back another day to do the rest. I didn't want to be there after dark, and I definitely didn't want to run into whoever had been using that house. I was packing up my gear around 4 when I heard it. A voice distant but clear, coming from somewhere deeper in the town. It was a man's voice, I think, though I couldn't make out words. It sounded like he was calling to someone, or maybe just talking. I stopped and listened, trying to figure out where it was coming from. But the acoustics in that hollow were strange. Everything bouncing off the ridgelines and the trees. I called out again, louder this time, asking if anyone was there. The voice stopped. I waited maybe 2 minutes, then started walking back toward my truck. I didn't run, but I was moving faster than I needed to. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing on one of the porches or watching from a window, but there was nothing. The town looked exactly the same as when I'd arrived, empty and still. I made it back to my truck and drove out without stopping. When I got home that night, I looked over the photos I'd taken. Most of them were what I expected, rotted buildings and overgrown roads. But there was one photo taken from the porch of that better-preserved house that I didn't remember framing. It showed the interior of the house, the sleeping bag in the chair, and in the far corner, half hidden by shadow, what looked like a figure standing against the wall. I zoomed in on my computer, trying to see if it was a trick of the light or some debris, but the shape was too regular. It looked like a person, thin and still, facing the wall. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept telling myself it was someone squatting in the house, that I'd just missed seeing them when I looked inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I would have noticed. The house wasn't that big, and I'd been paying attention. The next day, I called my supervisor and told him I needed another day to finish the survey. He asked if there was a problem. I said no, just that the terrain was rougher than expected. I didn't mention the voice or the photo. I drove back out that Wednesday, earlier this time, and brought a better camera and a can of pepper spray just in case. The road in looked the same. The forest looked the same. But when I got to the town site, things had changed. The sleeping bag and chair were gone from the house. The fire pit had been disturbed, the stones scattered. And there were new footprints everywhere, dozens of them, crisscrossing the roads and the yards, like a lot of people had been walking around in the few hours since I'd left. I stood in the middle of the main road, if you could call it that, and tried to make sense of it. The prints were different sizes, some small, some large, but they all looked fresh. The mud was still damp from a light rain the night before, and the edges of the prints were sharp. I started following one set, the largest, which led toward the church. The door was open, hanging on one hinge, and I could see inside. There were more prints on the floor, in the dust and debris. They led to the far wall, where someone had scratched something into the wood. It was a date 1972, and below it a series of tally marks. Maybe 30 or 40 of them. I took a photo and backed out. I didn't want to be in there anymore. I spent the rest of the day finishing the survey, working as fast as I could without screwing up the measurements. I didn't hear any voices, didn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched was constant. It wasn't paranoia, or at least it didn't feel like it. It felt like walking through a space where people were supposed to be but weren't, where the absence was so strong it had weight. I finished just before dark and drove out. I filed my report the next week, and the developer bought the land, though I don't know if they ever did anything with it. I never went back, and I made sure to turn down any assignments in that county. But I still think about the footprints, about how many there were and how fresh they looked. I think about the tally marks in the church, and the date and what it might have been counting. And I think about the photo, the one with the figure in the corner. I deleted it eventually, but I can still see it in my head. The way the shape was standing so still, facing the wall like it was waiting for something. I don't know if it was a person or something else, and I'm not sure which option bothers me more. The second account comes from a man whose job took him into the bones of a town that had been dead longer than he'd been alive. I work for a utility company that services parts of Kentucky and Tennessee, mostly small towns and rural areas. My job is to inspect old infrastructure, things like power lines, transformer stations, water mains, anything that's still technically on the grid but hasn't been maintained in years. A lot of times I'm going into places that are barely inhabited anymore, places where maybe one or two families are still hanging on and everyone else has moved away. In the spring of 2 years ago, I got sent to check on a transformer station in eastern Kentucky, near a town that had been mostly abandoned since the 90s. The company still had equipment there, and legally they had to inspect it once a year, even though it wasn't really serving anyone anymore. My supervisor gave me a map, some old service records, and told me to document the condition of the station and note if anything needed to be decommissioned. The drive took me most of the morning. The roads were bad, a mix of potholed asphalt and gravel, and the GPS kept losing signal. I passed a few houses, some lived in, some obviously empty, and a couple of old gas stations that were boarded up. The closer I got to the town, the more it felt like I was driving backward in time. The trees were thick, the kind of dense second-growth forest that takes over when people stop clearing the land, and the few buildings I saw looked like they'd been left exactly as they were when people walked away. The transformer station was on the edge of what used to be the town center. It was a small brick building with a chain-link fence around it, and the equipment inside was ancient, probably installed in the 60s. I parked outside the fence and let myself in with the key my supervisor had given me. The lock was stiff, but it worked, and I started doing my inspection, checking voltage levels, looking for corrosion, taking photos of anything that looked off. The station was functional but outdated, and I noted in my report that it should probably be decommissioned. There wasn't anyone left in the area to serve, and the equipment was a liability. I finished the inspection in about an hour and locked up, but before I left, I decided to walk around a little, just to see what the town looked like. It wasn't much. There was a main street, maybe 3 blocks long, with a few buildings still standing. I saw an old post office, a diner, a hardware store, all of them empty and collapsing. The windows were broken, the doors were hanging open, and the interiors were full of trash and leaves and animal nests. There were a few houses, too, set back from the road, most of them in worse shape than the commercial buildings. The whole place had that heavy, damp smell of rot, and the only sound was the wind moving through the trees. I was about to head back to my truck when I noticed the school. It was set a little apart from the rest of the town on a low hill, and it was bigger than I expected. 2 stories, brick, with a row of windows across the front, and a flagpole out front that was leaning at an angle. The doors were closed, which was unusual, because every other building in town was open. I walked up to the entrance and tried the handle. Locked. I don't know why I cared. It wasn't part of my job, and I had no reason to go inside. But something about the school being locked when everything else was open bothered me. I walked around the building, checking the other doors, and found one on the side that had been forced open. The frame was splintered and the lock was broken. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The hallway was dark and narrow, with doors on both sides leading to classrooms. The floor was covered in debris, old papers and broken furniture, and ceiling tiles that had fallen in. The air was stale and cold, and there was a faint smell of mildew. I turned on my flashlight and started walking, just looking around, not really sure what I was looking for. The classrooms were all the same. Desks overturned, chalkboards covered in water stains, shelves collapsed. In one room, I found a stack of textbooks, rotted and falling apart, with a publication date of 1987. In another, I found a teacher's desk, with the drawers pulled out and emptied. There was graffiti on some of the walls, the kind you'd expect from teenagers, names and dates and crude drawings, but most of it was old and faded. I was about to leave when I noticed something at the end of the hallway. There was a door different from the others, heavier, with a small window set into it. I walked over and looked through the window. It was another hallway, narrower and darker with stairs leading down. I tried the door. It was unlocked. I'm not an idiot. I know you don't go into basements in abandoned buildings, especially alone. But I also know that my job sometimes requires me to check spaces that other people don't want to go into, and I've been in plenty of basements and crawl spaces and attics that were fine. So I opened the door and started down the stairs. The basement was larger than I expected. A long, low-ceilinged space with pipes running along the walls and a concrete floor. There were storage rooms on one side, all of them open, and I could see old desks and chairs and boxes of supplies stacked inside. At the far end of the basement, there was another door, closed, with a handwritten sign taped to it that said boiler room. I walked over and tried the door. It opened easily. The room beyond was small and cramped, with a massive old boiler in the center and a mess of pipes and valves radiating out from it. The boiler was cold and dead, hadn't been used in decades. But what caught my attention was the floor. There were footprints in the dust, recent ones, leading from the door to the boiler and back. Someone had been down here and not that long ago. I stood there for a while, trying to figure out why anyone would come down to a boiler room in an abandoned school. There was nothing worth taking, no copper or anything valuable, and it wasn't the kind of place you'd use as a shelter. The footprints were too deliberate, like someone had come down with a purpose. I started looking around more carefully. On the wall next to the boiler, there was a panel with a series of switches and dials, all of them old and rusted. Below the panel, scratched into the concrete wall, there were words. They were hard to read because of the poor light, but I got close and made them out. It said, "Stayed too long." I backed out of the room and headed for the stairs. I didn't run, but I was moving faster than I had been. I got back to the main hallway and out the side door, and I stood outside in the sunlight for a few minutes just breathing. I told myself it was nothing, just some kid who'd broken in years ago and scratched something on the wall, but the footprints were fresh. Couldn't explain that away. I got in my truck and drove back to the main road. I didn't look back at the school. I filed my report the next week and recommended decommissioning the transformer station. I also noted in the report that the school building showed signs of recent trespassing and should be checked by local authorities, but I don't know if anyone ever followed up on it. A few weeks later, I mentioned the school to a coworker who'd been with the company longer than me. He'd worked in that area before. I asked him if he knew anything about the town or the school. He said the town had been coal dependent, and when the mine closed in the early 90s, most people left. The school had closed around the same time, but he also said there'd been an incident, something to do with a student who died in the building, though he didn't know the details. He said people avoided the place after that. I didn't ask any more questions. I still think about the footprints, though, and the words on the wall. I think about how fresh the prints looked, and how far down I had to go to find them. And I think about the fact that the school was locked from the outside, with only one forced entry point, which means whoever made those prints had to have come in the same way I did, and might still have been in the building when I was there. I've been back to that county a few times since then for other jobs, but I don't go near that town. I take the long way around, even if it adds an hour to my drive. There are some places that don't want you there, and you can feel it as soon as you step inside. That school was one of them. Another file, this one from a man who thought he was retrieving old equipment, but found something that had been deliberately hidden. I used to work for a company that bought and resold industrial equipment, things like generators, compressors, heavy machinery that businesses and factories didn't need anymore. My job was to drive out to these sites, assess the equipment, and arrange for transport if it was worth salvaging. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well, and I got to travel, mostly around Ohio and West Virginia. About 4 years ago, I got a lead on a site in central West Virginia, an old coal processing plant that had been shut down in the 80s. The company that owned it had gone bankrupt decades ago, and the property had changed hands a few times before being abandoned completely. A local scrap dealer told me there was still equipment inside, stuff that hadn't been stripped, and if I could get access, I could probably make a decent profit. I did some research and found out the plant was part of a larger complex that had serviced a coal town a few miles up the valley. The town was gone now, completely empty, and the plant had been locked up and forgotten. There were no records of anyone maintaining it or even visiting it in the last 20 years. The land was technically owned by a holding company that didn't respond to inquiries, so I figured if I went out there and didn't damage anything, I'd be okay. I drove out on a Saturday in March. The weather was cold and overcast, and there was still snow on the ground in patches. The plant was about a mile off the main road, accessible by a gravel drive that was mostly washed out. I had to park my truck at the bottom and hike the rest of the way. The plant itself was huge, a sprawling complex of metal buildings and concrete silos, all of it rusted and sagging. The chain-link fence around the perimeter was mostly down, and the gate was open. I spent the first hour just walking around, taking photos and notes. There was a lot of equipment still inside, big machines I didn't recognize, and some smaller stuff like pumps and motors. A lot of it was too far gone to be worth anything, but I thought I could salvage a few pieces. I marked the locations on a map I'd sketched out and started working my way deeper into the complex. That's when I found the offices. They were in a separate building, 2 stories, set apart from the main processing area. The windows were broken and the door was hanging off its hinges, but the structure was solid. I went inside and started looking around. The first floor was what you'd expect: desks and filing cabinets, all of them empty or full of ruined paperwork. But on the second floor, at the end of a hallway, I found a door that was locked. I don't usually force doors, but this one looked newer than the rest of the building, like it had been installed more recently. That didn't make sense for a place that had been abandoned for decades. I used a pry bar to pop the lock and went inside. The room was small, maybe 10 by 10, and it was set up like a storage closet. There were shelves on one wall with boxes stacked on them, and a desk in the corner with a chair. The boxes were labeled with years, ranging from 1979 to 1984. I opened one and found files, incident reports, payroll records, that kind of thing, but there was another box, unlabeled, shoved in the back of the bottom shelf. I pulled it out and opened it. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, black and white, taken at the plant and in the town. Most of them showed workers, men standing in front of machines or gathered in groups. But there were others that didn't fit. Photos of empty buildings, of streets with no people, of interiors that looked staged, like someone had set up a scene and then photographed it. And then there were the photos of the woods, dozens of them, all taken at night with flash, showing trees and undergrowth and nothing else. At the bottom of the box there was a ledger, handwritten, with dates and initials and short notes. The entries were mundane at first, things like checked fence, no issues, or reported to supervisor. But starting in 1982, the notes changed. They got shorter and stranger. Saw lights. 3 missing. No explanation. Do not go past the ridge. I sat there for a while, flipping through the ledger and looking at the photos, trying to figure out what I was looking at. It felt like evidence of something, but I didn't know what. The dates matched up with the plant's last years of operation, and the initials in the ledger could have been workers or supervisors. But the notes didn't make sense in the context of a coal plant. Why would someone be checking fences at night? Why would anyone be taking photos of empty woods? I put the ledger and a few of the photos in my bag and left the room. I didn't take anything else. I spent the rest of the afternoon marking equipment and taking measurements, but my mind was on the box. When I got back to my truck, it was almost dark, and I was glad to be leaving. I didn't do anything with the photos or the ledger for a few weeks. I told myself it was just old paperwork, not my problem. But eventually, I got curious and started looking into the plant's history. I found a few articles from the 80s about layoffs and shutdowns, but nothing unusual. Then I found an obituary for a man who'd been a supervisor at the plant. He died in 1984, a few months before the plant closed. The cause of death was listed as a hunting accident, but the article mentioned that his body had been found several miles from where he was supposed to be hunting, in an area that wasn't marked on any maps. I started looking for other names from the ledger, but I didn't find much. A few of the initials matched workers who'd been listed in old payroll records, but there was nothing online about what had happened to them. Then I found a post on a local history forum from someone who'd grown up near the plant. They mentioned that in the early 80s, people had started leaving the town, not because the jobs were gone, but because something had happened that no one wanted to talk about. The post didn't say what, but it mentioned that the company had sealed off parts of the plant and the surrounding land and told people to stay away. I stopped researching after that. I didn't want to know anymore. I burned the ledger and the photos in my backyard one night, and I told the scrap dealer that the plant was a loss, nothing worth salvaging. He didn't argue. I never went back to that area, and I turned down any leads that came from that county. But I still think about the notes in the ledger, especially the last one. It was dated March 12, 1984, just a few weeks before the plant closed, and it said, "Do not go past the ridge, they are waiting." There was no explanation, no context, just that. And I think about the photos of the woods, all those empty frames taken at night, and what might have been just outside the range of the flash. What the next man found suggests that not everyone who visits these towns leaves when they're supposed to. I work for a nonprofit that documents abandoned places, mostly for historical purposes. We take photos, interview old residents if there are any left, and archive information about buildings and infrastructure before they completely fall apart. It's volunteer work, and I do it on weekends and whenever I have time off from my regular job. Most of the places we document are old factories or schools or downtown districts that have been left to rot, but every once in a while we get sent to a town that's completely gone. 2 years ago, I was assigned to document a ghost town in southern West Virginia. The town had been built around a timber mill in the early 1900s and had lasted until the mid-60s before the mill closed and everyone moved away. There were maybe a dozen buildings left, scattered along a dirt road that didn't connect to anything anymore. The State Historical Society wanted photos and measurements before the buildings collapsed completely, so I drove out there one October weekend with my camera and my notes. The drive took longer than I expected. The main road was fine, but once I turned off, I was on logging roads that weren't maintained and barely passable. I got stuck once and had to back up and find another route. And by the time I reached the town site, it was mid-afternoon and the light was already starting to fade. The buildings were in worse shape than I'd expected. Most of them just shells with collapsed roofs and walls leaning inward. I started with the largest structure, which I guessed had been the mill office, and worked my way down the road. I was photographing the third building, an old house, when I noticed the car. It was parked behind one of the other houses, almost hidden by overgrown bushes. It was a sedan, maybe 10 or 15 years old, and it looked out of place. The paint was faded and the tires were flat, but it wasn't rusted the way you'd expect if it had been there for years. I walked over and looked inside. The seats were covered in dirt and leaves, but there were things in the car that didn't make sense. A jacket folded on the passenger seat. A water bottle in the cup holder empty. A notebook on the ocortuillos. Dashboard swollen from moisture but still intact. I opened the door, which wasn't locked, and picked up the notebook. The pages were stuck together and most of the writing was illegible. but I could make out a few words here and there. It looked like someone had been keeping a log or a journal. I saw dates from 2019, which was about 5 years earlier, and phrases like checked perimeter and no change. There was a map too, tucked inside the back cover, hand-drawn, showing the town and the surrounding area. Certain spots were marked with X's, maybe 8 or 10 of them, scattered through the woods and along the road. I put the notebook back and closed the door. I didn't know what to make of the car or the journal, but I didn't like it. I decided to finish my documentation quickly and leave before it got dark. I went back to the road and continued taking photos, working faster now, and that's when I saw the tent. It was set up behind the mill office, in a small clearing that was mostly hidden from the road. It was a cheap camping tent, the kind you'd buy at a discount store, and it was still standing, but the fabric was torn and the poles were bent. I walked over and called out just in case someone was inside, but there was no answer. I unzipped the flap and looked in. The tent was empty, but there were things inside. A sleeping bag, unrolled and dirty. A backpack, partially unpacked, with clothes and canned food and a flashlight. A portable stove still set up with a pot sitting on it. And there were papers scattered on the floor of the tent, some of them folded, some of them loose. I picked one up and saw that it was covered in handwriting, the same handwriting from the notebook in the car. The page was a list of observations, dated entries like a journal. The first entry I read was from June 2019 and said, "Arrived at site. No signs of other visitors. We'll set up base and begin documentation." The entries continued from there, one every few days, noting weather, animal activity, conditions of the buildings. But by late July, the tone started to change. The entries got shorter and less detailed, and the handwriting got messier. One entry from early August said, "Heard something last night. Close to tent. Couldn't see anything." Another from a week later said, "They're moving between the buildings. Counted 4, maybe 5. Staying away from main road." The last entry I could make out was dated August 19th, 2019. It said, "Can't leave. Tried twice. Road changes. Tent is the only safe place. Do not go out after dark." I dropped the paper and backed out of the tent. I looked around the clearing, at the mill office and the woods beyond, and I felt like I was being watched. There was no sound, no movement, but the feeling was overwhelming. I grabbed my camera and my bag and started walking back toward my truck, and I didn't stop or look back. When I got to my truck, I realized I'd left some of my equipment near the mill office, but I didn't go back for it. I got in and started driving, and I didn't slow down until I was back on the paved road. I filed a report with the Historical Society, but I didn't mention the car or the tent or the journal. I said the site was too unstable to document safely and recommended they send a team with better equipment. A few weeks later, I looked up the town online, trying to find any information about what might have happened there. I didn't find much, just a few mentions in old timber industry records and a notation that the site had been surveyed for redevelopment in the 80s and rejected. But I did find a missing person report from 2019. A man from Ohio, an amateur historian, had been reported missing by his family in September of that year. He'd told them he was going to West Virginia to document an old town and he'd never come back. The description matched the things I'd found: the car, the tent, the journal. I printed the report and kept it in a folder at home, but I didn't do anything with it. I didn't know what I could do. The family had filed the report. The police had investigated, and nothing had come of it. The case was still open but inactive. I thought about calling them, about telling them what I'd found, but what would I say? That I'd found his camp and his notes and his car, but no sign of him. That the last entry in his journal said he couldn't leave? I still do documentation work, but I avoid sites in that part of West Virginia. I tell the Historical Society that I'm too busy or that I don't have the right equipment, and they assign someone else. I don't know if anyone's been back to that town, and I don't want to know. I think about that last journal entry a lot, about what it meant that he couldn't leave, and about the fact that his camp looked like he'd just stepped away for a few minutes, even though it had been sitting there for years. The following account is from someone who learned that the empty streets aren't always empty. I used to do photography, mostly landscape and urban exploration, and I'd post my work online to a small following. It wasn't a career, just something I did on weekends and whenever I had free time. A lot of my best work came from abandoned places, factories and train stations and old downtowns, places with interesting light and decay. I'd get tips from other photographers sometimes. People would message me with coordinates or rough directions to places I might not have heard of. In the fall of 2021, I got a message from someone I didn't know. They didn't use a real name, just a screen name, and their profile was mostly empty. The message said there was a ghost town in eastern Tennessee that would be perfect for my style, and they included a set of GPS coordinates. They said the town had been abandoned in the 70s, and most of the buildings were still standing. They also said I should go during the day and leave before dark, which I thought was just common sense advice, but they repeated it twice in the message. I looked up the coordinates and saw that the town was in a pretty remote area, off a state route that didn't see much traffic. I checked a few maps and satellite images and confirmed that there were structures there, so I decided to make the drive. I went on a Saturday in late October. Clear weather, good light. The drive took about 3 hours, and the last 20 minutes were on dirt roads that weren't marked on my GPS. The town was small, maybe 20 buildings total, spread along a single road that ran parallel to a creek. The buildings were in surprisingly good condition, most of them wood frame houses with porches and intact roofs, though the paint was peeling and the windows were broken. There was a church, a small one, and what looked like it might have been a general store. Everything was overgrown, the yards full of weeds and saplings, but you could still see the layout of the town clearly. I parked at the edge of the town and started walking, taking photos as I went. The light was perfect, low and golden, cutting through the trees and lighting up the buildings in that way that makes everything look both beautiful and sad. I spent a few hours working, moving from building to building, getting different angles and compositions. I was completely focused on the work, and I didn't notice the time passing. Around 4 p.m, I was photographing the church when I heard something. It was faint, like voices, coming from somewhere deeper in the town. I stopped and listened. The voices were too distant to make out words, but there were at least 2 or 3 people, maybe more. I thought maybe there were other photographers or explorers, so I called out, asking if anyone was there. The voices stopped. I waited a minute, then kept working. I figured whoever it was had left or didn't want to be bothered. But a few minutes later, I heard the voices again, and this time they sounded closer. I walked toward the sound, toward the far end of the town where the road curved and the buildings got smaller. I called out again, but there was no answer. I reached the last building, a small house with a collapsed porch, and looked around. There was no one there. No cars, no tire tracks, no footprints in the dirt. The voices had stopped again. I stood there for a while, feeling uneasy, and then I decided it was time to leave. The sun was getting low, and I didn't want to be there after dark. especially if there were other people around that I couldn't see. I walked back toward my car, and that's when I noticed the thing I'd missed before. The buildings weren't empty. I don't mean there were people inside, but there were signs that people had been there recently. In one house, I saw a table set with dishes, old ceramic plates and cups, arranged like someone was about to eat. In another house, I saw a bed, still made, with a quilt folded at the foot. In the general store, there were items on the shelves, canned goods in boxes, all of them covered in dust but organized, like a store that was still open for business. I started looking more carefully at the buildings, and I saw more things that didn't fit. Clothes hanging on a line behind one house, faded and rotting but still pinned up. A rocking chair on a porch, positioned like someone had just gotten up and walked away. A child's toy, a wooden horse sitting in a yard. I took photos of all of it, but I was moving faster now, and I was starting to feel like I shouldn't be there. The light was fading, and the shadows were getting longer, and the town felt different than it had a few hours earlier. It felt like it was waiting for something. I got back to my car and loaded my gear. As I was about to leave, I heard the voices again, and this time they were loud, right behind me. I turned around and saw movement, just for a second, at the edge of the tree line near the church. It looked like people, several of them standing in the shadows, but when I looked directly at the spot, there was nothing there. I got in my car and drove out, faster than I should have on those dirt roads. When I got home, I downloaded the photos and looked through them. Most of them were what I expected, empty buildings and overgrown yards. But there were a few that I didn't remember taking. They were framed wrong, like someone else had been holding the camera, and they showed parts of the town I hadn't visited. In one photo, there were figures, blurred and indistinct, standing in a doorway. In another, there was a person, or something shaped like a person, standing in the middle of the road, facing the camera. I deleted those photos immediately. I didn't post any of the others. I told myself the camera had malfunctioned, or I'd accidentally triggered the shutter, but I knew that wasn't true. I went back through my messages and tried to find the person who'd sent me the coordinates, but their account was gone. The message was still there, but the profile had been deleted or deactivated. I stopped doing urban exploration after that. I still take photos, but only in places that are clearly safe and public. I don't respond to tips from strangers anymore, and I don't go looking for abandoned places. I think about that town sometimes, about the voices and the movement in the trees and the photos I didn't take. And I think about the message, about how it said to leave before dark, and how I almost didn't. The sixth account comes from a trucker who made the mistake of following an old map. I've been driving trucks for almost 20 years, mostly regional routes through Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia. You get to know the roads pretty well, the good ones and the bad ones, the shortcuts and the dead ends. You also get to know which places to avoid, the towns that are falling apart, the stretches of highway where you're more likely to break down or get stranded. It's part of the job, learning the landscape. About 3 years ago, I was hauling a load from Lexington to Charleston, a route I'd driven dozens of times. It was late January, cold and clear, and I was running a little behind schedule because of a delay at the loading dock. I was trying to make up time, so when I saw a turnoff that I thought might cut 15 or 20 minutes off the drive, I took it. The turnoff wasn't marked on my GPS, but it was on an old paper map I kept in the cab, one of those state highway maps from the 90s that showed all the back roads and logging routes. The map indicated that the road would loop through the hills and reconnect with the main highway about 30 miles north. It looked straightforward, so I figured it was worth the risk. The road started out fine, 2 lanes, paved, not much traffic. But after a few miles, it narrowed and the pavement got rough, and then it turned to gravel. I should have turned back, but I was already committed, and I didn't want to waste time backtracking. I kept going, and after another 10 miles, I started seeing buildings. It was a town, or what was left of one. There were houses on both sides of the road, maybe 15 or 20 of them, all of them empty and falling apart. There was a gas station with the pumps still standing, a post office, a few other buildings I couldn't identify. The whole place looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry, like people had just locked their doors and left. I slowed down to maybe 20 miles an hour and kept driving, looking for the road to continue on the other side. That's when I noticed the truck. It was parked in front of one of the houses, an old semi, probably from the 80s, with no trailer attached. The cab was rusted and the tires were flat, and it looked like it had been sitting there for decades. But what caught my attention was the company logo on the door. It was the same company I'd worked for 10 years ago, before they went out of business. The logo was faded but still readable, and I recognized it immediately. I stopped my truck and got out. I don't know why, curiosity maybe, or just the weirdness of seeing that logo in a place like this. I walked over to the old truck and looked inside. The cab was empty, no personal items, no paperwork, nothing. The seats were rotted and the dashboard was cracked, but the keys were still in the ignition. I tried to open the door, but it was rusted shut. I walked around the town for a few minutes, looking at the buildings and trying to figure out what had happened. There were no signs, no historical markers, nothing to explain why the place was abandoned. The houses were in better shape than I expected, and some of them still had furniture inside, visible through the broken windows. I saw a kitchen table with chairs, a couch in a living room, a bed in an upstairs bedroom. It looked like people had just walked away and never come back. I was about to get back in my truck when I noticed the road didn't continue. I walked to the far end of the town and saw that the road just stopped, turned into dirt and weeds. No sign of where it used to go. I checked my map again, and according to the map, the road should have kept going for another 20 miles before reconnecting with the highway. But there was nothing, just forest. I started feeling uneasy. I got back in my truck and turned around, planning to drive back the way I'd come. But as I was turning, I saw something in my mirror. There were people, or shapes that looked like people, standing on the porches of some of the houses. I stopped and looked back, but when I turned my head, there was nothing there. I looked in the mirror again and saw them again, maybe 4 or 5 figures, just standing there, not moving. I didn't wait to figure it out. I drove out of that town as fast as I could on that gravel road, and I didn't stop until I was back on the main highway. The detour cost me almost an hour, and when I got to Charleston, I was way behind schedule. My dispatcher asked what had happened, and I told him I'd taken a wrong turn. I didn't mention the town or the old truck or the figures on the porches. A few weeks later, I tried to find the town on a current map, using the coordinates from my GPS, but there was nothing there. The satellite images showed forest, no buildings, no roads. I checked the old paper map, and the turnoff I'd taken was marked, but there was no indication of a town. I thought maybe I'd misremembered or the map was wrong, but I knew what I'd seen. I still drive that route, Lexington to Charleston, but I don't take shortcuts anymore. I stick to the main highways and I don't trust old maps. I think about that truck sometimes, the one with the logo from my old company, and I wonder how it got there and who was driving it. I think about the figures on the porches and whether they were real or just shadows. And I think about the fact that the road didn't go anywhere, even though the map said it should. Another case, this one from a man who was hired to secure a site and found it was already occupied. I work private security, mostly short-term contracts for construction sites, vacant properties, places that need someone to keep an eye on things until they're sold or demolished. It's not exciting work. You sit in a car or a trailer. You walk the perimeter a few times a night. You file reports if anything looks off. Most of the time, nothing happens, and that's fine with me. In the winter of 2020, I took a contract for a property in eastern Kentucky. It was an old coal town, abandoned since the 90s, and a development company had bought the land with plans to build a resort or a housing development, something like that. My job was to make sure no one was trespassing or stealing materials from the existing structures while the company finalized their plans. The contract was for 2 weeks, and they set me up in a small trailer at the edge of the site with a generator and basic supplies. The site was bigger than I expected. There were maybe 30 or 40 buildings, most of them houses, spread along a valley with a creek running through it. The buildings were in rough shape, roofs caved in, walls leaning, but some of them were still mostly intact. There was a main road through the center of the site, unpaved, and a few side roads that branched off into the hills. The company had cleared some of the brush and marked the property lines with stakes and tape, but otherwise the place looked exactly like it had been left. I started my first shift on a Monday evening. The sun set early, around 5, and by 6 it was full dark. I did a perimeter check, walking the main road and shining my flashlight into the buildings, looking for signs of trespassers. I didn't see anything unusual. No footprints, no trash, no evidence that anyone had been there recently. I went back to the trailer and settled in for the night. Around 10, I heard something outside. It sounded like footsteps, boots on gravel, coming from the direction of the main road. I grabbed my flashlight and went out to check. The night was cold and clear, and I could see my breath in the beam of the light. I called out, identifying myself as security, and asked if anyone was there. No answer. I walked down to the road and looked around, but I didn't see anyone. I went back to the trailer and made a note in my report. I figured it was an animal, maybe a deer or a dog, and let it go. But an hour later, I heard it again. The same sound, footsteps, closer this time. I went out and walked the perimeter again, covering more ground, checking between the buildings and along the creek. Nothing. This kept happening for the next 3 nights. Every night, around the same time, I'd hear footsteps, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always moving. I started carrying a radio and a heavier flashlight, and I walked the site more thoroughly, checking every building and every road. I never saw anyone, but I kept finding small things. That didn't fit. A door that I'd checked the night before and left closed would be open. A window that had been boarded up would be loose. A chair on a porch would be moved. On the 4th night, I decided to stay outside instead of going back to the trailer. I parked myself on the porch of one of the larger houses, near the center of the site, and waited. It was colder than the previous nights, and I had to keep moving to stay warm. Around midnight, I saw a light, faint and flickering, coming from one of the buildings at the far end of the road. I watched it for a few minutes, trying to figure out what it was. It looked like a lantern or a candle, moving inside the building, passing by the windows. I walked toward it, keeping my flashlight off, moving quietly. As I got closer, I could see that the building was one of the better preserved houses, 2 stories with most of its walls intact. The light was on the 2nd floor, and I could see shadows moving in the windows. I circled around to the back and found the door open. I went inside and climbed the stairs, which creaked under my weight. The second floor was a hallway with 3 rooms. The light was coming from the room at the end. I walked toward it and stopped at the doorway. The room was empty, no furniture, no debris, but there were candles, 5 or 6 of them, arranged in a circle on the floor. They were lit, burning steadily, and in the center of the circle there was a photograph, old and faded, showing a group of people standing in front of a building that looked like one of the houses in the town. I stood there for a while, trying to make sense of it. Someone had been there recently and had set this up, but I hadn't seen anyone and I hadn't heard anyone leave. I picked up the photograph and looked at it more closely. The people in the photo were dressed in old clothes, maybe from the 70s or 80s, and they were all looking at the camera with expressions that were hard to read. Not smiling, not frowning, just blank. I heard footsteps behind me on the stairs. I turned around and called out, but there was no answer. I went to the hallway and looked down the stairs. Nothing. I went down to the first floor and checked every room, but the house was empty. I went outside and walked the perimeter of the building, shining my light into the woods and along the road, but I didn't see anyone. I went back to the trailer and called the development company, told them I'd found evidence of trespassing and recommended they install better fencing and maybe some cameras. They said they'd look into it and asked if I wanted to finish the contract. I said yes, but I didn't go back to that house. For the rest of the 2 weeks, I kept seeing things that didn't make sense. Lights in buildings that were supposed to be empty. Footprints in the mud that appeared overnight. Objects moved, doors opened, candles lit. I documented everything in my reports, took photos, but I never saw a person. My last night, I was walking the main road around midnight when I heard voices. Multiple people, talking in low tones, coming from the direction of the creek. I walked toward the sound and the voices stopped. When I got to the creek, there was nothing there, just the water running over the rocks. I finished the contract and turned in my reports. The development company thanked me and paid me on time, but they never followed up about the trespassing. I heard later that the project was canceled. Something about environmental concerns and zoning issues. The land was left as it was, still empty, still abandoned. I don't take contracts for abandoned sites anymore. I work retail lots and office buildings, places with cameras and lights and people around. I still think about that photograph, the one I found in the circle of candles. I kept it, and I've looked at it dozens of times, trying to figure out who those people were and why someone would set up a shrine to them. I think about the voices by the creek and the footsteps and the lights in the windows. And I think about the fact that I spent 2 weeks in a place where I was never alone, even though I never saw another person. The final file is from someone who went looking for history and found that some records are kept in places that should be left alone. I'm a genealogist, which means I help people trace their family histories and build family trees. Most of my work is done online now, through databases and archives and digitized records, but sometimes you have to go to the source, to old courthouses and churches and cemeteries, to find the information you need. I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've gotten used to traveling to out-of-the-way places and dealing with incomplete or damaged records. In the summer of 2022, I was hired by a client who wanted to trace their family back to a coal town in West Virginia that had been abandoned in the 60s. The client's great-grandparents had lived there, and they wanted to know what had happened to them after the town closed. I started with online resources, looking through census records and death certificates and old newspaper articles, but I couldn't find much. The town had been small, and a lot of the records had been lost or never digitized. The client was willing to pay for travel expenses, so I decided to go to the town and see if I could find anything on site. The town was about 4 hours from where I live, in a remote part of the state where the roads are narrow and the towns are few and far between. I drove out on a Thursday morning in late July, and the weather was hot and humid, the kind of heat that makes everything feel slower. The town wasn't on any current maps, but I had directions from an old county atlas, and I found the turnoff without too much trouble. The road in was overgrown and rutted, and I had to drive slowly to avoid damaging my car. The town itself was smaller than I expected, maybe 10 or 12 buildings. Most of them collapsed or close to it. There was a church, which was what I was looking for, because churches often kept birth and death records that weren't filed with the county. The church was in better shape than the other buildings, still standing with most of its roof intact. The door was hanging open. I went inside and immediately wished I'd brought a mask. The air was thick with dust and mold, and the floor was covered in debris, pieces of the ceiling and walls that had fallen in. There were pews still in rows and a pulpit at the front, and along the walls there were shelves that had probably held hymnals or Bibles. I started looking through the debris, carefully, trying to find anything that might have been a record book. I found 3 books, all of them water-damaged and falling apart. 2 of them were useless, the pages stuck together and the ink completely faded. But the 3rd one was partially legible. It was a baptism and burial register, covering the years from 1952 to 1965. I sat down on one of the pews and started going through it, page by page, looking for the names I needed. I found my client's great-grandparents about halfway through the book. They'd had 4 children baptized in the church, and there were entries for all of them with dates and names. But there were also entries for burials, and I noticed something strange. Starting in 1963, the burials increased sharply. There were pages and pages of them, dozens of names, all recorded in a short period of time, from late 1963 to early 1964. The entries were brief, just names and dates, no causes of death, but the sheer number was alarming. I started counting, and I got to over 60 burials before I stopped. That was more than half the population of the town, based on the census records I'd found. I photographed every page of the register, making sure I captured the names and dates, and then I kept looking around the church. At the back of the building, near the door, there was a small room that might have been used for storage or as a vestry. The door was closed but not locked. I opened it and found more books stacked on a shelf, all of them in the same condition as the register, damaged but still readable. I pulled them down and started going through them. They were journals, handwritten, by someone who I assumed was the minister or a church leader. The entries were dated, starting in 1962 and continuing through 1965. The early entries were mundane, notes about services and baptisms and community events. But starting in mid-1963, the tone changed. The entries became shorter and darker. One from August 1963 said, "Families are leaving. No one will say why. Attendance is down." Another from October said, "More deaths. Doctor says it's influenza, but no one believes him." A third from December said, "The company closed the mine. People are angry. Some are talking about staying no matter what." The entries from 1964 were even worse. In January, "We buried 6 today. No more room in the cemetery. Had to use the field behind the church." In February, "I can't explain what's happening. People are dying and no one knows why. The ones who are left won't talk about it. In March, I'm leaving tomorrow. I tried to convince the others to come, but they won't listen. They think if they stay, it will stop. I know it won't. The last entry was dated March 15th, 1964. It said, "God forgive me for leaving them." I closed the journal and put it back on the shelf. I took photos of the relevant pages and left the church. I didn't want to be there anymore. The sun was still high, but the town felt dark, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I walked back to my car and started to leave, but as I was driving out, I saw something that made me stop. There was a field behind the church, just like the journal had mentioned, and it was full of markers. Not headstones, just wooden crosses and metal stakes. Maybe 100 of them, scattered across the field in uneven rows. I got out of my car and walked over. Most of the markers didn't have names, just dates, all of them from 1963 and 1964. A few had names carved into the wood, but the carvings were faint and hard to read. I took photos of the field and the markers, and then I left. I drove straight home, and I spent the next week compiling my findings for the client. I sent them the photos and the information I'd found, and I explained what the record suggested, that there had been some kind of epidemic or disaster in the town in 1963 and 1964 that had killed a large portion of the population. The client thanked me and paid my fee, and that was the end of it. But I kept copies of everything, and I've gone back through the records several times since then, trying to figure out what happened. The burials in the register don't match any known outbreaks of disease in that area during that time period. There were no newspaper articles, no official reports, no mention of the town in any state or federal records. It's like whatever happened there was deliberately left out of the historical record. I've thought about going back, about trying to find more information, but I can't bring myself to do it. I keep thinking about the journal, about the minister's last entry, about how he left and the others stayed, and about the field full of markers behind the church. I keep thinking about the fact that 60 people died in a town of 100 in the span of a few months, and no one outside the town seemed to notice or care. And I keep thinking about the feeling I had when I was there, the feeling of being watched, and the fact that when I looked at the photos later, I saw something I hadn't noticed at the time. In one of the photos of the field, there are figures, just shadows really, standing between the markers, too far away to see clearly, but definitely there. I didn't see them when I was taking the photo, and I don't know if they were people or something else. I deleted that photo eventually, but I still remember what it looked like, and I still wonder who or what was standing out there among the graves. Tonight we've walked through towns that were left behind, places where the road stopped going and the map stopped matching reality. We've heard from men who followed their work into these forgotten valleys and hollows, who thought they understood what abandonment looked like, and who learned that emptiness isn't always what it seems. The accounts you've heard tonight came from different years and different counties, but they share patterns that are hard to ignore. The footprints that appear overnight, the lights in windows of buildings that have no power, the voices that stop when you get close enough to see who's speaking, the records that show more people stayed than should have been possible, the feeling consistent across every file that these places aren't waiting to be reclaimed. They're waiting for something else entirely. These men went home. They filed their reports, finished their contracts, and found reasons to never go back. But the towns are still there, still marked on old maps, still accessible to anyone curious enough or unlucky enough to take the turn. The buildings are still standing, the roads are still passable, and whatever made these men leave is still there too. In the spaces between the houses, in the churches with their locked doors and their buried records, in the forests that edge up against the abandoned streets. Some places die because the work runs out, or the highway moves, or the young people leave. Those places rot quietly, and eventually the forest takes them back, and that's the end of it. But there are other places like the ones you've heard about tonight, that die for reasons no one writes down, where the leaving happens too fast or too completely, where the evidence suggests that something was very wrong and nobody wanted to say what it was. Those places don't rot the same way. They sit in the hollows and the valleys, and they wait. And sometimes people wander in, and some of those people come back out with stories that don't fit into any reasonable framework. If you're ever driving through Appalachia, through the mountains and the coal country and the small towns that barely show up on the map anymore, and you see a turnoff that looks like it might save you some time, or a road that your GPS doesn't recognize but that shows up on an old paper map, or a cluster of buildings set back in the trees with no signs and no markers, think carefully before you stop. Think about the men whose accounts you've heard tonight, about what they found and what they left behind, and ask yourself if saving 20 minutes or satisfying your curiosity is worth the risk of becoming another story, another file, another voice trying to explain something that doesn't have an explanation. These towns were abandoned for a reason. Most of the time that reason is economic or practical or easy to understand. But sometimes the reason is something else. Something that the people who lived there understood but couldn't fight. Something that made them lock their doors and walk away and never speak about it again, even to their families, even in their records. And sometimes that reason is still there, waiting in the empty houses and the overgrown streets, patient and persistent, for the next person who doesn't know any better. Thank you for listening to Blacktop Files. If this episode stayed with you, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our next case. Turn on notifications and let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Stay safe out there, especially on the back roads. And remember that not every shortcut is worth taking, and not every empty place is as empty as it looks.